Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Friday, January 9, 2026 meeting of the New Hampshire Legislative Study Commission on the environmental and public health effects of PFAS compounds. At the moment, we are short of a quorum, so we will not proceed with any official business, but we'll continue with our updates. So we'll pass over the approval of the minutes of the December 12th, 2025 meeting with thanks to Amy Costello for helping out with that. And I want to welcome Colleen Smith from DHHS to our meeting as well. So just checking on Ray Brislin's status. Ray, I know you're there. Do you know if the Senate President confirmed you at this point? So we can count you as a quorum member? All right, well, can't hear, but we'll find that up. And let's move right along to our DES update, Mike.
Okay, well, thanks, and Happy New Year, everyone. It's glad to see you all again. I guess to go over, not a lot changed since our December meeting, but to go over some of the updates and as always, the text of the written notes that I provide will be more comprehensive than what I discuss in person here, but just to kind of try to hit the highlights here. As you know, the facility closed and the building was demolished, and we're still monitoring. We're waiting still for a final demolition and decommissioning report to be submitted by St. Gobain. We expect to receive that at the end of this month, by the end of this month. So hopefully have something to share with that at our next monthly meeting. As far as POET system installations go, as of January 7th, there have been 805 POET systems that have been installed. And of those, 774 have gone through the process of verifying that they're effective and treating appropriately. And so those are all considered officially complete. The others are in process. With regard to waterline connections, we talked a lot about the various projects in all the towns that have gone to continuing either waterline installations or connections to existing water lines. We talked a lot over the last several months, over the last year or so, about the Hillcrest Road area in Litchfield. That has now been completed. We've also talked about completing service connections to existing Pennachuck water mains in the towns of Bedford and Londonderry. That's been going on since 2024. And I think we're at, we did have, there were a few places where ledge was encountered and they elected to put in a POET system instead of a water line installation because it became too difficult to provide water to that home. Similarly, we've talked about St. Gobain's consultant finalizing design packages for extensions and connections to existing mains in Merrimack, in the Wildcat Brenda Lane area. And the water main extension project on Brenda, John, and Edward Lanes is considered nearly complete, with paving on John and Edward Lanes completed in September of this past year. Paving for Brenda Lane was delayed due to the condition of the road, and that's anticipated to be completed this spring. And then connections to existing water mains in Merrimack and Bedford that began July 24. The contractor installed the service line from stop to end at 36 locations. However, one curb stop requires some additional work. Water meters have been installed at 12 locations in Bedford and 23 locations in Merrimack, and the bottled water deliveries have subsequently been discontinued. One property owner opted to have a line extended from the curb stop to the house, but not to actually connect to the house's plumbing. And a total of 6 properties have not responded to the application requests for those areas. For the more recent term sheet attachments that keep amending what the plans are for alternate water, the ones attachments 23 through 27 include approximately 17 properties with proposed municipal water connections. The company is proceeding with waterline work for those properties under either existing contractors through change orders, or they've issued new contracts to complete that work. With regard to Londonderry, I was hoping by now I'd be able to tell you it had all been reconciled. Londonderry is still working with Saint-Gobain on the specifics of that, but I think that we remain hopeful. I don't have any reason to believe that isn't going to happen. They're just working out some final details. And on that note, I would note that Londonderry is getting very proactive, to their credit, looking at providing alternate water and extending public water to areas that are not in the consent decree, areas east of High Range Road. And so they're doing a lot of proactive planning, looking at where they can get funding and looking at how they would accomplish that. And they're holding a public meeting. Some of you may know this. I think in January, late January, on the 28th in the evening. They're calling it a water symposium, and they're making plans for some significant outreach to the public, I think in advance of their town meeting this spring. And I suspect you'll be hearing something about that. And I know that they reached out to DES for participation in that meeting, and I expect that we'll have a good representation there to help out. We continue to get various term sheet attachments and addendums, with regard to proposals from the company to remediate additional water supply wells. And the most recent one was received in November of last year, and we anticipate that we will get another one in January, sometime this month. So that continues. With regard to water supply sampling, well sampling, the company, has proposed to conduct long-term monitoring of drinking water wells under a groundwater management zone work plan, which would support the implementation of a groundwater management permit to be issued in the future. And the company began conducting monitoring under that plan at the end of last January. And in general, the work plan proposes to conduct sampling so that by the end of this calendar year, there will be at least 6 PFAS sampling event results for each property that's eligible for sampling. So that's a significant body of sampling, and gives us some additional, reliable information, a little bit of trend, information over a relatively, still a short time, but still some more information than we normally have when we just get one individual sample. The work plan was reviewed and approved by DES last January, and as of January 7th, just a couple days ago, the company has sampled approximately 1,529 properties that were eligible for monitoring under their work plan. They anticipate sampling between 100 and 200 properties per month during this calendar year to meet the requirements of the work plan, and they have been submitting bi-monthly status reports on that sampling effort. The most recent bi-monthly status report was submitted in October, and there'll be a link to that in the notes. The properties that exhibit exceedances of a standard will continue to be issued bottled water eligibility letters, and they'll also be identified in the monthly alternate water status reports to the department. Since the start of sampling associated with that work plan, approximately 170 additional properties have been identified exceeding the ambient groundwater quality standard for PFOA and have been offered bottled water by the company. With respect to concerns about areas that have not been sampled within the consent decree area, the company submitted a work plan in July of this last year to look at some of those previously unsampled areas within the towns of Bedford and Litchfield. Those are areas near the edge of the consent decree outer boundary where the company had originally refused to sample. DES issued an approval of that work plan in August with comments recommending collection of additional groundwater quality parameters in addition to just PFOA and PFAS. And the company's been sampling in accordance with that approved work plan and intends to sample each of the identified properties twice before the end of next month. So we'll get some additional data on those properties. With regard to the remedial action plan, we've talked about this for a long time. It was originally submitted in May of 23, and then February 9th in 2024, there was a RAP plan and a RAP addendum, and those were determined to not meet the requirements of our rules, and the deficiencies were detailed in a letter that we wrote back in October of 24, and there'll continue to be a link to that letter and those supporting documents in the notes. The company's consultant identified data gaps that need to be addressed to respond to our comments and prepared a revised RAP addendum. They submitted a work plan back in July, identifying the objectives and the scope of a supplemental investigation to fill those data gaps. We approved that work plan with comments back in August, and the company installed temporary monitoring wells and conducted soil sampling in accordance with that work plan this past month in December. They intend to continue working on additional investigation activities this month in January to support development of a RAP addendum. And so, it's our hope that once that is done, we would see a RAP sometime this year, sometime probably by this spring. We were notified, we've talked about this before, about 702 Daniel Webster Highway, a property across the way, not far from the facility, that was being proposed for development and had some significant concentrations in shallow soils on the property. They worked with a company to devise a solution for that. What they ended up doing, they generated a soil pile that couldn't be reused on site due to space limitations. So we'd sent a letter saying, to the company saying you've got to help resolve that. And so we've been informed that the developer purchased the adjacent parcel of land and has used that area to place excess soil generated as part of the project. We received a proposal from the developer and issued an approval letter back in September. And we understand that the soil has now been moved to that property and stabilized and covered, and the developer is working to create an activity and use restriction that will be recorded on the property deed to provide notice that the soils are there. So that seems to be reconciled for the time being. With regard to developing, we develop soil remediation standards, as you know, and that has pointed up, a need for a lot more data on soil impacts in this study area around the Saint-Gobain facility. We did request in a letter in September of last year, we requested that the company submit a work plan to evaluate PFAS distribution in soil within the outer boundary of the consent decree area. And the company indicated they plan to update the soil sampling work plan for Bedford, Merrimack, and Litchfield that they had submitted way back when, March of 2020. The revised work plan will incorporate data collected by others and propose additional sampling locations. We anticipate that the results of that sampling effort will not only refine the understanding of the nature and extent of impacts resulting from releases at the facility, but also be used to support guidelines for soil management practices within the outer boundary as development projects continue to occur throughout the area. DES had requested that the work plan be submitted by November of last year. However, the company's proposed submitting the revised work plan during the first quarter of 2026. So we would anticipate seeing that work plan come into us by the end of March. And I think that's probably what I got. The notes for this will include, the graphics and charts that demonstrate sort of the progress of remedy implementation, whether it's water lines or POETs. So all that will be included, and I'll share that with the chair and the clerk. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Maureen and then Rosemary.
So we talked about this last time. I'm a little confused, maybe naive. Soil remediation, right, and soil standards, to me as a community, my expectation would be if land was being developed or that project in the town where they had that bridge project that they knew the soil was not okay, I think they had to dispose of it in an appropriate place. So I don't know if this is what we're to expect. Like, if any, let's just say moving forward, any lot that's developed in the area, we know the soil is contaminated, it's confirmed it's contaminated, and they just say, oh, we'll just buy an adjacent lot and stick it there. So, we're just moving contaminated soil around. That's not a remediation action to me. To me, I think it should be hauled off to the appropriate place as hazardous waste, because that is what it is. And we're kind of dancing around, and I'm just troubled. We as a state have an immense amounts of data over the last 10 years. I think we have more than any state that I know. People are amazed by it. Data isn't really solving the problem. When a work plan includes more testing, the testing hasn't really led to satisfactory solutions and sensible common sense. I'm not naive. We're not going to wave a magic wand and it's all going to be pristine. I know that. But this is an example of, I don't know whose decision it is, if it's yours unilaterally as a department, and if this is what we're to expect when a person wants to develop and they know that they have a contamination problem. To me, they should go to the responsible party. The responsible party should make it right, or they could take legal action. But it almost seems instead there's some sort of I don't know, it just feels a little handshake colluding to me. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm just saying that's how it feels, where they can just consult with St. Gobain and they're like, oh, you can buy this other lot and put the dirt there, and then that's approved. How is that? I mean, like I said, we're not going to clean this whole town up, but each piece, when there's development, that is an opportunity to do something right. It isn't, that site should be, let's face it, it should be a Superfund site. There's reluctance of the state to declare Superfund sites to big business. I get that, but how can that be approved? How can that be okay that we say, oh, they'll just secure it and it'll stay there and then we'll wait and see in the future? It isn't that someday we're going to say, oh, we have a way to destruct this all and break down the PFAS and we'll go back to these lots and do it. What we're going to end up with is what we have at Gilbert Crossing, a pile of toxic PFAS-ridden dirt that will sit there. It's been sitting there for 7 years, 6 years, however long Gilbert Crossing went up on the Flatley site. And, this is a community to have piles of dirt that in fact are hazardous substances that are just left there, whether secured or unsecured. It isn't acceptable. So help me understand how this is okay and how we're implementing the laws or the regulations or the rulemaking, whatever category it may be, that we have in place. I'm constantly puzzled by this piece.
We've talked about this before. What this reflects is the outsized nature of this problem, right? And the reality is that it is such a large area of impacted soils that have the potential or already have impacted groundwater quality, that we're not going to excavate and haul off our way out of the problem. It's not going to.
So we're just going to leave Merrimack as a contaminated town forever, and whatever abutting towns, Litchfield, we haven't addressed any of the agricultural land that's, I'm sure, highly contaminated there. We're acting like they filtered their water and it's okay. And, food is grown in those crops. So, to me, one lot at a time is a way that we can do this. We can say, this is one parcel. This is an immense parcel. This isn't the size of some parcels we have in town. That is the way to do this. It's right there. It's in the epicenter, and one development at a time. When they get their approval, you say, well, this is what has to happen. They then can go after St. Gobain to compensate for that. The developers shouldn't be bearing that cost, but they seem to think they are, and they seem to be grateful that they got, the cheap way out. I don't blame them as a developer, but St. Gobain is not bearing responsibility for this, and it should be hauled away. And it isn't the whole town, it's that piece. And as pieces are developed, where does that dirt go? And what if there wasn't an abutting site? What was, there was a woman in this community a number of years ago that reported to, it was before you were there, Mike, Clark. It was the end of Clark's reign in his role, which he played so well. So she reported to him that dirt was being removed, from property in Flatley that was ordered not to be removed. And she followed a truck and said it was going to this street near Londonderry Fish and Game. She described the street. She followed the truck down there, and then she got a little nervous, and there was some unsavory things that were being said by the project manager at Flatley, who was threatening people on public media, and she became very nervous. He has a very unsavory history, if you look into that, which I did. But that dirt was going there, and I don't know if that was proper, but the state was under the impression that the dirt was not to be removed from the site. So there are things going on here that are not okay. And if a resident sees something and makes a call, they're the watchdog, eyes on it, and nothing is really done about anything. There doesn't seem to be, these are baby pieces of accountability. If we look at the scope of Saint-Gobain internationally, the profits they pulled out of this little facility alone are just billions and billions of dollars. They need to do these small bites. That isn't going to break the bank, to say to them, well, guess what? This dirt needs to be properly disposed of because this site is going to be developed. Development is in the best interest of, the town and the state, I guess. It's not my personal preference, but that's reality. So, but we can address this, but there seems to be this lack of will, and I'm not sure where that's coming from, because we do have rules that we didn't have, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but they aren't really, when you say it's a huge area, so we can't really do much about it. I mean, that we can do things as they come up. I thought when the town was doing that bridge project, they inquired what they should do. And I think they were told that they had to handle that dirt in a certain way. And didn't they have to haul it off? And
no, my understanding is that they were able to manage all the soil on the site. The project was amended in such a fashion that they didn't have any, as I understand it, none of the soils needed to be removed from the site.
Yeah, so that was a different thing than a development with a pile. Think of it, if you live in a town and, you raise your family there and you move there because you really appreciate the conservation trails and the community and everything that we have here supposedly. And as the years go by, the place that you love and pay taxes steeply for, but it's your choice, you see these piles of dirt appearing around town because this is happening, and that's just okay. It's not, to me, an acceptable answer. We're not, we have this habit as a nation where we push undesirables, to the down back, if you will, or wherever we can, and upon other communities sometimes. So within this own community, where it's, people use that phrase years ago about the lack of, class structure for PFAS and regulating as a class, and we called it whack-a-mole, right? We heard that phrase being said a lot. The dirt is kind of like a version of whack-a-mole, or move it around. It just feels very, very, very gamey. But the other way to look at it that I want you to think of is, if this is where you lived, and any of you think about this, and you are driving around your town and many beautiful areas in town, when you see development happening, you hope that the town planning board made the right requests and it looks nice and it's properly done and all the rest of the stuff, which they do for the most part. But then you see this pile of dirt and, it just sits there. Grass grows over it. Rain does go onto it. It does, do whatever it does wherever it gets washed. It's a different pattern of washing. And when the wind blows and we have drought, which we definitely have, you see the dust from these piles of dirt, wafting here and there, through the air. And we know these particles travel miles, even when you can't see them. So we're not addressing the problem. So part of me, as a devil's advocate, says, why have soil standards in a state? We're one of the few states who went down this road, maybe the first, or close to the first, but we're not, it means nothing. What does it mean if we can't manage soil? I'm not a soil specialist, but I like to think I'm kind of big on common sense, and it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, to be clear, this soil, which is now being managed on a parcel that is part of the property because they acquired it,
They bought it.
will be covered and vegetated, so it won't be subject to windblown transport of contaminated soil.
So there's a heap of dirt with a tarp over it, and we assume the tarp
No, it's
doesn't.
not a tarp. It'll be vegetated. It'll be provided with a vegetative cover.
Well, look at the Flatleaf Corporation.
I don't want to
Their
cut you off,
pilot has had grass grow on it, and technically it's vegetation covered, but it's very unsightly, and it's the old expression, you can, I don't know, I'll just say one more thing because I'm a little irked over this. It's that old expression that people used to say in New England, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig, and no offense to the pigs. That's it, I'm done.
Rosemary?
Okay, thank you, Chris. So Mike, I have a few questions sort of on that 702 DW Highway property. One is, did the developer have to get any approval by DES to move that dirt over to his new parcel?
Yes.
Because I do think, okay, so he did, good. And then what would have happened if he wasn't able to do that? Did the state have any recourse to force Saint-Gobain to take that dirt away or compensate the developer?
Yeah, so great question. So the problem was that when they first were doing their project with the parcel that they owned, which did not include the adjacent parcel, the nature of the development, what the development dictated meant that there was a certain volume of soil that could not remain on the site. If they had been able to manage the soil on the site, they probably wouldn't have necessarily needed to talk to us. They would have done their development, no soil would have left the site, and they would have completed the development. But because of the nature of the building they had to do, it was a job that had excess soils. And when they sampled those soils to determine their options for disposal, they learned that they had pretty significant concentrations of PFAS. And so that it wasn't like getting rid of soils normally that, native soils that aren't contaminated, they have other options for them. They would have had to go to a waste facility at a pretty high cost. And so they reached out to us and said, hey, what do we do about this? And we wrote a letter to Saint-Gobain saying, you got a responsibility to help these guys out and figure it out. And, and they could have just written a check and sent it off to a solid waste facility. And in many cases, with sites in our program, that's exactly what might happen. But we've had to be a little more creative here with respect to this, because we have to be careful what we wish for, right? If we say that anytime soils can't stay on the site, they've got to go at the most expensive possible way to a disposal facility. Well, first of all, there's not going to be adequate capacity at facilities to take soils like that. And the other issue that we get into, which is it's unfortunate, but this is an outsized problem. You all know that we've all been working on this for 9.5 years. There's a reason for that. It's a huge problem, right? And so we recognize that the most important thing to do is make sure that people aren't getting exposed to contaminants, particularly through drinking water, which is the most sensitive way of being exposed to this contamination. So we work very hard to focus the company on making sure that they meet their responsibilities to provide safe alternate drinking water to everybody who's impacted by their releases. And if we suddenly turn around and say, no, we've got a multi-billion-dollar plan to have you take care of all the soils whenever they arise, our feeling is that would very likely have an adverse impact on their ability to do the most important thing, which is to provide that safe, clean drinking water. So we're working at this. This is unprecedented for us. We're trying to figure out the way to deal with it. We're trying to get our arms around what the soils are in the larger area. That's why we're working with them to get a more detailed soil sampling plan. But in the meantime, when it comes to development, we've had to make the decision that if you can manage the soils on the site, eliminate direct contact as a result of the way you finish out the site, and not exacerbate in any way the potential impacts to drinking water or groundwater, then that's a reasonable solution. And so in this case, it's somewhat at arm's length from us because we were not involved directly in the discussions, but we connected the two parties, connected those developers with the company, and they figured out that they could acquire this adjacent parcel and that it would give them enough space to manage those soils safely on that site without increasing or exacerbating the risk to groundwater, and actually improving the risk of soil contact, because they'd be putting it under cover and putting an activity and use restriction on the property. We accepted that as a reasonable solution for this particular development project, and that's how it landed.
Yeah, and I just want to, I guess a little bit, I have a different perspective than Laureen does. I do believe that when we have contaminated soils with PFAS, which there really isn't any way of removing PFAS from soil, that the scale that we have in our area, I mean, you would be taking depths of multiple feet of square miles for a long time of soil up. It just isn't practical. And I'm just hoping technology can catch up with this problem and find a way of treating and removing PFAS in situ from contaminated soils. But I am glad to hear that just moving that soil from one parcel to the other, that should not be allowed without DES approval. So I'm glad to hear that. And I'm wondering, and I should probably know this, but I would hope that in any development where there's going to be a disruption of soil to a certain extent, that we do require, maybe it's at the local planning board level, but we would require to have the soil tested for PFAS, because I could see a situation, and there may be a situation already with the new hot rise building, where they've disturbed the soil, possibly moved it off site, but there was never any thought that they would have or requirement for that soil to be tested for PFAS to ensure that it wasn't going to be taken someplace else to contaminate.
Yeah, I mean, that one of the issues that is related to us looking for more information about soil quality across the whole consent decree area is that we would like to have a comprehensive soil management plan for the whole consent decree area that would establish those very specific requirements and also lay out what the options are for practicable disposal or handling or management of those soils. So that's something that's still very much on our radar screen.
Yeah, maybe we can work something legislatively at the end of the year, Mike, because I'd also like to ensure some personal safety protection of any workers that are working around those kind of soils.
Sure.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Do I see a hand up? Is that you, Don? Don, did you have your hand up?
I did.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, so to kind of continue on that question, it sounds like this is a specific, I guess, solution, if you will, on how to manage soils just within the St. Gobain responsibility groundwater management zone boundary. Would that be handled different if we were far outside of this boundary, that the St. Gobain would not be responsible, say we were 20, 30, 50 miles away somewhere, and PFAS was found in soil at that point? I guess what would the solution be? Would it still be not to move that soil off site, or would there have to be treatment of that soil in some respect? And I'm not sure if this is I assume this isn't consistent with other types of contamination.
No, you're right. And it's because of the nature of this specific and the magnitude of this specific problem. If we go to a site 100 miles away in northern New Hampshire where there's been a more conventional release of PFAS, from a discharge or a spilled container or something like that, if there's soils there that don't meet the standard, then they pose a risk to groundwater. The expectation would be that those soils would be disposed of, either treated in place if they could be to reduce the concentration, or excavated and moved off-site for proper disposal. So it is not the same. It's not an apples to apples comparison. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. And just to kind of take off from that, a couple things. I know, looking back at the MVD's, Merrimack Village District's wells PFOA concentrations, which is basically primarily the main PFAS violation that exists in the drinking water, in the well water. That has been, it varies as much as almost 50% from one season to the next. However, when you look at the overall trend in most of the wells since 2016, there is still an upward bias to a lot of the, if you drew a trend line through it, would be still on the increase. And that leads me to wonder, and I've asked this question before, and I don't think anybody's even, and I don't know if there's a way we can even determine what I'm asking, but the groundwater contamination is a function of the soil, that the percolation of the precipitation runs through that soil and takes the PFAS in the soil and brings it into the groundwater. So if you're looking at continually increasing groundwater levels, there's a certain point where until the vast majority of the PFAS in the soil is washed into the groundwater, that groundwater will keep increasing until the source of the PFAS, which is in the soil, is depleted. And at some point, the levels in the groundwater should start coming down. But I don't know that anybody has calculated or somehow looked into how far, when is that happening? When is that going to happen? Because right now we're dealing with wells that are in a certain, we're changing our media based on a certain level of groundwater contamination.
Right.
And if that continues to increase, projections on that cost, it's going to change, right? So we're going to have to keep changing this out more frequently if the groundwater concentrations continue to increase. And we don't really know how far ahead that is going to stop happening in reverse. Now, I know there are ways to model that theoretically. I've had, master's level degree courses in that. So I'm not practicing in that specific field at the moment. That was like, 20 years ago or so, but is there any, is there any, does that question exist in anyone else's concern at the DEA?
Absolutely, and I think the short answer, we don't know the answer to that yet. We still have relatively short period of time of monitoring to base it on. As you know, there's a lot of noise in the data. There can be seasonal variations. There can be other things happening, other pumping stresses in an aquifer that can change things. So it's not easy to untangle. I will tell you, we are getting now more sort of seasonal and year-to-year data on some drinking water wells. We don't necessarily see that upward trend. That's something that I probably would want to ask Andy and Jeff Martz about, because they're a little closer to that data than I am. But I think the answer is we just don't know yet. And if you think about the conceptual model for how this happened, right? You had a facility that operated from 1985 through certainly about 2005 or 6 with relatively high concentration emulsions that they were using to coat fabric. So they had high levels of PFOA in their feedstocks. And so basically, for on the order of 30 years, or excuse me, 20 years, they were emitting very likely rather high concentrations of PFOA to the atmosphere. And those, certainly our working model of how that happened is that those, either through rainfall or particle deposition deposited on the earth, and then, rainfall then drove them down through the unsaturated zone into the groundwater table and into groundwater. And they've also made their way to the bedrock aquifer. So we don't, it's such a large study area. We don't have a tremendous amount of data on what across the study area for what those concentrations are at depth. We certainly know some things about them, but there's a lot more that we would like to learn that might help us put a better estimate on, whether we've hit a peak concentration or not, or whether we're going to see larger concentrations, or whether we're in the declining years. And it'll even if we are, it'll be a slow decline, right? Because we've still got mass in the formation. But I don't think we're going to know the answer to that question broadly for quite some time still. There's still a lot more data and a lot more time series data that we would need to collect in order to make an educated guess about that.
Well, I'm glad you're aware of it. I just wanted to make sure someone's thinking in those respects.
We do think about it, and it informs our interest in a much more robust soil sampling. Obviously we're already working to get the best and the most groundwater data that we can get, but we need to know a lot more about soil quality across the area
Just one last follow-up on that is, I don't know if you received it. I sent you an email in December, I think it was on the 22nd, in a trade journal I was reviewing. There was a large-scale field demonstration of what they call polymer stabilized activated carbon for in situ treatment of PFAS. In the site that they performed this on, they found like 4 orders of magnitude reduction, and it's just by pumping some kind of a carbon polymer into the formation, which looks like it had, bound up or something, the PFAS in there. So I drew a lot of parallels with the St. Gobain site. It was a site that was highly contaminated, which we know the St. Gobain location is, highly contaminated, and it was a more of a sand and gravel type formation. I would like to get that over to the consultants who are looking at remedial action measures over there. I just don't know, with MBD being in litigation with St. Gobain, I don't know that I want to be involved in the contact with that. So I'm not sure how to play this out, but it was probably one of the most intriguing trade journals at this scale. That's the thing, is there's a lot of laboratory tests and mushrooms and these other things, but something that is robust enough at this scale, it seemed to be the first thing that I've seen in years that looks like it could solve a problem at the scale we're talking about. And it's not going to solve the problem down to drinking water standards, and I don't think that's what we're asking them to do. I think we want to bring it down several orders of magnitude just to, reduce the PFAS load that's percolating and going by, groundwater discharge into the Merrimack River and just in the whole vicinity itself. So I don't know if you got that email or not.
I did get your email, and I apologize, I didn't respond. I don't think I responded yet. We're familiar with that technology and variations of it. It's been around for a while. But I think you make a good point that while it's not something we're going to, inject that material throughout the study area, but certainly at the plant site, something like that might be something that could have a meaningful impact on release of the massive contaminants to the greater aquifer. So I will be sure to share that study with their consultants, and that's something that certainly, that's a technology that we're aware of. It's been used. I'm not sure if it's been used in New Hampshire for PFAS specifically, but it's certainly been used. A lot of that technology has been applied to chlorinated solvent sites here in the state. So that's something that would be, part of the toolbox, something that they could consider and that we could review if that's something that they might like to propose.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thanks for that reminder. I'll go back and look at that.
Sure.
Other comments, questions? Let me just add that the situation at 702 Daniel Webster Highway is one that's susceptible to being repeated. I think it would be really helpful to have that soil sampling in the GMZ that we'd like St. Gobain to do to inform the community planning boards about how vigilant they have to be. But it is a property that got its planning board approval, and was under construction before PFAS was detected at the site. And I'm sure if the Merrimack Planning Board or any other planning board knew that a site had contaminated soil, they would have some conditions on approval that would address that. But there certainly is the potential for those things to fall between the cracks. And then there are very small scale removals of material and replacement, like every septic system that gets replaced around the state could potentially be taking PFAS contaminated soil, depending on what people dump down the drain, and moving it elsewhere. So, you know, it's a big problem, and as long as we continue to import PFAS compounds into this state, it's going to be something that that will crop up again and again, and probably get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, I don't know if people know what's happening, or planning board, you know, they're residents, and they're doing in their meetings, what I see is when things come before them, they have PFAS on the mind now, which is really great to see. And what they typically do with everything is they ask if DES has been consulted, if they've given them a plan, you know, the whole bit. So what you see is when the developer, whoever comes back for their, as they go through that cumbersome process for approval, they will say to them, so are you all set with that? And they'll say, oh yes, we talked to DES, we got a plan, everything's all set. So the planning board, upon hearing that, leaves that, they don't get involved in the weeds. So sometimes I hear the meetings, not always, but sometimes somebody calls it to my attention. I watch it and I think of questions they should have asked, but they didn't know to ask them. And they just assume that it's taken care of because it's blanketly done by DES. So that's the end of it. And that's why DES has an immense role to play. And, you know, Saint-Gobain has been, I think, tiptoed around, but it looks like we embolden them to kind of call the shots. Because when that option is there over the dirt is in a pile, pay to haul it away, write a check or pay for it yourself. We know those, there's 3 different types of hazardous waste places that they could send it to for different things. It exists. Instead, the pile is there, not hauled away. That's what it boils down to. So the planning board is assuming that whatever was decided upon is safe and follows the law. And that's as far as they're going. They're not gonna, you know, kind of debate like I am because they don't really have that information. So they are cognizant of PFAS, but they are assuming that when any developer tells them, even there was the person proposing some sort of hazardous waste recycling center abutting conservation land and near the Merrimack River, people that were up in arms about that, but that's very early in the stage. And part of the questions they're asking as well, and I was listening to that hearing and they were blatantly lying. There was no way that DES would have said what some of the things they said they did. I know that for a fact. So, you know, that I think we still live in a state where we have real decent people that are going to take people on their word. And there's a gap, you know, there's a big gap here and somebody needs to be standing up for us. And I really strongly feel that if Saint-Gobain advises someone to pick up a parcel next door and they got that at a deal and it was cheaper to buy a piece of land than it was to haul off a pile of dirt, you know, what was the difference in price? You know, I don't think that should have been okayed. I really, really don't. Because we're setting a precedent to other people in town that basically says, don't worry about the soil standards, just find a place to put the dirt. As long as you're in their contamination zone or anywhere in Merrimack, it'll be okay because we're already contaminated. That's what it boils down to. And the planning board doesn't know what to do with that.
One more question for Mike. Is it outside the GMZ, Mike? Is there any resampling of drinking water wells that is going on or is planned to go on?
Well, DES has certainly sampled, you know, hundreds, if not actually thousands of wells outside the consent decree. I don't know that there's a specific, there's not really a program for resampling those other than to the extent that those, you know, individual residences or businesses have a point of entry treatment system. Typically, there would be periodic monitoring, not at the very least of obviously the treated water, but usually you want to also look at what's the incoming quality of the water into the treatment system, so that data may be being collected by the private vendors who are providing that service, operation, and maintenance of those treatment systems. We're not necessarily going to get that data unless someone decides to share it with us. So there's certainly less. There's not really a system or an infrastructure for getting repeat sampling data for wells that are outside the consent decree area. Having said that, across the state where we have other sites that have PFAS as contaminants of concern, many of those sites have groundwater management permits and groundwater management zones, and there would be a number of monitoring wells, and in many cases also nearby drinking water wells that would be routinely monitored for PFAS. So we are going to see, if you're interested in sort of what are the aggregate trends for PFAS contamination across the state, we'll be getting that data on a regular basis as a result of those groundwater management permits and their annual, and periodic sampling requirements. Usually they're on the order of 2 to 3 times a year that those wells are sampled under those permits.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other questions, comments for Mike? If not, Colleen, welcome. Any updates from DHHS?
I don't have any specific updates to share. I'm happy to join you. As Whitney had expressed last month, she has been diverted to some other responsibilities regarding the Rural Health Transformation Grant. So I will be taking her place as the DHHS representative. I'm the bureau chief for the Bureau of Public Health Protection. I took that role back in June. I've been with the department since 2008, formerly with the Food Protection Section, and then also with the Bureau of Infectious Disease. And so I'm happy to join you all and happy to answer any questions that you may have of me.
Thank you. Questions or comments for Colleen or on health in general? If not, move on to legislative updates. For those of you with bills or sponsoring bills, if you can just update where things are on the docket, and then Representative Mooney, if you know of any other legislation that hasn't been talked about, please let us know. So
I can kick this off.
sure.
I know the 4 bills we've been tracking have all been assigned to committees at this point, but I don't see that hearings have been scheduled. That may have changed since I last looked, but that's the status that I'm aware of. I also want to share with the group that there is a feature on the state webpage that I've been using recently, and it's a godsend. You can actually track bills, and whenever you can register an account, you can put in the bill you're interested in or the subject matter. And when there's an update on that bill's docket, you will receive an automatic email indicating what the update is. I can't say enough about this feature. Very, very helpful. And I'd be glad to send the link to start an account to track bills like that to you, Mr. Chairman, so you can distribute it to the rest of the committee if they're interested in signing up for automatic updates. Great feature.
Excellent. Yes, please do that. I will take advantage of that. Anything else on legislation? Amy?
Sorry, I just had a question for Colleen. In thinking about the rural health transformation funding that has come in, my understanding is that the state received more money than was anticipated. Do you know if that's true, and whether there's an opportunity for any of the interests of this commission to be?
I can certainly take that question back to Whitney and ask her that specifically. I do know, I think originally the grant was available for $100 million and then up to $200 million. And we've been just getting very small amounts of information so far, knowing that more is forthcoming, but happy to get more information for you on that.
I'd really appreciate it. I think that's what I had heard as well, Colleen, was that originally the state was anticipating 120 million, but has since been awarded 204 million. And wondering if the balance, the 84 million, provides, you know, maybe a percentage of an opportunity for PFAS remediation and making rural New Hampshire healthy again.
Yeah, I can certainly follow up on that question. Again,
Okay.
I don't know the specifics as to everything that was earmarked within that funding, and if there is some flexibility.
Yeah, I guess with knowing that 84 million was not earmarked and was maybe a surprise, it's sort of the opportunity that I'm questioning. So that would be, I think, of interest. Yeah.
Rosemary.
Thank you. I do have an update on one of the public hearings. There's a HB 1080, which is a bill sponsored by Representative Thomas. I believe Representative Murphy's on it as well, that would prohibit the sale of condoms and personal lubricants with intentionally added PFAS. And that hearing's been scheduled for January 15th in Granite Place, where we're holding all our hearings now while the renovation of the LOB is ongoing. Room 229, it's in, I think I said it's in front of Commerce Committee. It's at 1:30. But I do want to thank Representative Mooney. That is an excellent feature. And it's also made the lives of state reps a lot easier too. And they've even expanded our access, makes it easier to track things on our portal. So I think that will be a big help. Thank you.
Nancy.
Thank you, Chris. There is a bill that I've sponsored that actually, Mike, I'm going to be reaching out to you maybe at the beginning of the week if you're around. HB 1389 relative to PFAS facility liability. I got your email. I know we need to talk. So if you're free, maybe on Monday, we could chat. If you're
Sure.
okay, great. Thank
Be
you.
glad to.
Thank you. Okay, anything else on legislation? If not, actually, it should be old business. Following up on subcommittee formation. I know it's only been 4 weeks since our last meeting, and most of which was holidays, but I haven't heard from anybody about wanting to form a committee. I think Vanessa Remillard from DES or Amy let me know that they have hosted those meetings in the past, and so could do so going forward if that facilitates interest. But we'll keep that open and come back to it. We are expecting next month, and much thanks to Mindy, to have one of the authors of the Arizona study present at our next meeting. And that is on February 13th. And since we now have a quorum, I guess I'd like to take up approval of the December 12th, 2025 minutes. And unless there are any comments, I'll take a motion to approve. I think motion by Kimberly and
I have a change on it.
Okay, you do. Great. Okay.
They have me as an
Let's get a
attendee.
motion first and a second, and then we'll take comments.
I had a change to the minutes.
Oh, okay.
They have me down as a representative, Kimberly Queenan. I am not a representative.
That's my mistake.
That's okay. We'll try again. I'll try again, but not yet.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other corrections or comments before we take a motion? Okay, then I will take a motion to approve as amended. Anybody like to make that motion? Motion by Representative Mooney and seconded by Representative Rung. Any further discussion? If not, I will ask for ayes. Any opposed? And I will compare attendance and note abstentions accordingly. And with that, just to announce, our next meeting is February 13th at 2 p.m. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I don't see any public present making comments. So have a good weekend. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.